here's the thing, Professor Glaude. What I hear you saying is if we pursue a political agenda that actually uplifts working people across a racial spectrum, that shows that you can just govern in a way that takes away the appeal of racism and the appeal of needing to see yourself as superior because that at least gives you some edge in a world that's cruel and results in precarity, that will have an effect on people's racial attitudes in a way that is beneficial.
It can, yes.
I think that's absolutely true.
Exactly.
And I also buy in, I love the research that came out of Demos a year or two ago, and they continue to put out, about how the most persuasive political message is in fact one that points out that wealthy elites use race to divide working class whites from working class people of color. And that even white voters are motivated by the idea that race is being particularly used as a tool to cleave us apart for the benefit of the wealthy. So that it's not a class only narrative isn't actually as effective on white voters as one that mixes race and class in that specific way. So I'm with you 100%. But here's what I sometimes hear and what it feels like. I want to go back to the text.
Sure.
So this is just following the part that we were reading before. Okay. Mm-hmm. Baldwin came to understand that there were some white people in America who refused to give up their commitment to the value gap. And the value gap is what you talk about in your last book, where even policies, because of the underlying racism, even if it's so-called value neutral, it gets implemented in ways that have disproportionate effects for Black people. Right. And that's why it's so important to get at the nut of racism. For him, we could not predicate our politics on changing their minds and souls. They had to do that themselves, which is, I was like, well, I don't know that they would. I don't know what would motivate them to do so. Okay, but we'll move past that because we talked about that a little bit. In our after times, our task then is not to save Trump voters. It isn't to convince them to give up their views that white people ought to matter more than others. Our task is to build a world where such a view has no place or quarter to breathe.
Right.
Now, I read a sentence like that, and my question is, what does it look like? What does that mean to build a world where there is no place or quarter to breathe? Because if we're talking about let's pursue policies that lift up the working classes and make racism less appealing, then we're on the same page. But what I often read statements like this from interlocutors who are not especially invested in that universalist working class policy project. What they are invested in is ideas of, let's have a commission on racism. Let's talk about racism. They say things, let's root out racism. We have to be anti-racist. At the same time, they ignore progressive politicians, progressive policies, completely allow Joe Biden to get away with throwing the $15 minimum wage under the bus, allow us to get away with not having a conversation about healthcare as a human right in the middle of a global pandemic, are openly derisive of figures like Bernie Sanders and his supporters, calling them brown shirts and racist and every other kind of thing. And what it feels like is sometimes this very emotive anti-racist language becomes a stand-in for doing the substantive policy work that I agree can do a lot more to actually changing whether or not people feel like racism is the only crutch they have in this world that is increasingly precarious.
But the formulation that you read isn't that at all. In some ways, the formulation is to say, look, our politics in this country have been and continue to be constrained by our overwhelming desire to appeal to that particular kind of voter, the Trump voter, the latest name for the silent majority, the latest name for the forgotten American, the latest name for the Reagan Democrat. And those voters are at the center of the political imagination. And so you make, whether you're Clinton, where you're coming out of the Clinton model, right, or Clintonism or the third way, right, that particular voting constituency guides and directs how you imagine what's politically possible. Going back to the pragmatic invocation, right? We can't do this because these are our constraints. These particular voters who vote, these are the ones who hold these views. We can't imagine doing X, Y, and Z. I disagree with that view, right? So I want to decenter, right, that particular political model. Now, then I layer on top of that, right, not only the kind of desire to appeal to the disaffected white working voter, the person who participated in the Hard Hat Rebellion in 1970 that we've been trying to attract ever since they left, right? Instead of I layer on top of that, right? That oftentimes what it means to appeal to that voter is that we have to then mute certain questions or considerations around racial justice that hampers or hamstrings the very conception of democracy that we are trying to put forward. So we have to lift all boats in some ways. We have to pass policies that we know will disproportionately impact people of color, but we can't say it, right? Why? Because we don't want to alienate these folk, because that would be politically naive to say it, because we wouldn't be able to get this, that, and the other done. And in making that move, we actually fertilize the soil for the very thing, the very commitments that short circuit a radical reimagining of this place. So part of where you and I don't disagree, right, is that these things are not oppositional, right? We don't disagree with that. We both hold the same ends. I just hold the view, I should say this, and I get this from Baldwin, that America's original sin isn't slavery. America's original sin isn't even the genocide of native peoples. America's original sin is this belief that white people matter more than others. The other two are the consequences that follow from that. That's its original sin.
I struggle with this. I really struggle with that, and I want to be thoughtful as to why. We are all inculcated, I believe, with a level of white supremacy. We live in a society that tells us from birth and manifests for us whenever we turn on the TV or look around or see who gets to be president and who gets to be on the Fortune 500, that we live in a racial hierarchy.
Right. So
to that end, everyone implicitly, even if not consciously, understands that, this idea that white people are better.
Right.
However, if it's not conscious, and I think that for the vast majority of people, I'm of the belief that everybody's racist, right? This is not me saying that I don't think people are racist, but I think it's a mistake to think of it as so conscious that it's especially useful to necessarily talk in those terms in a political context.
So there you go again.
No, it is not. It's not about not upsetting people.
No, you're saying useful, pragmatic, and
yes, because I pragmatically want to change minds and have different outcomes and change policy and save lives.
But you're presuming that the practical requires a certain kind of speech.
It does.
You can't.
Professor Glaude, you can't, if I'm on the campaign trail, I cannot go up to, and I don't want to go up to someone and say, you're a racist, now vote for me.
No,
and this is true of Hillary Clinton voters too, who are also, Democratic Party voters too, who are also racist. I don't go up to them and say, you're racist, vote for me either.
No one, first of all, let's not characterize it in that way. No one is saying you're racist in that sense. People are saying, we all hold racist commitments, or we know that this society is by definition racist in the way in which advantage and disadvantage is distributed in this country, right? We can make that claim without falling into the kind of a worry or concern that practically it will subvert any effort to do good. When in fact, in the long run, in my view, not to say anything about it.
But
it's to subvert democracy.
That's a false trade-off. Like, no one is saying don't say anything about it, to consider the ways in which you frame it in a way that's accessible and relatable to people who don't think of themselves as racist. Here's the fundamental issue. If people don't see themselves as racist, you and I can roll our eyes and say that's silly, of course you're racist. No. But your ability to communicate what it means for them to be racist is going to be hampered by not starting from the start meeting them where they are.
So this is exactly what I try to do in Democracy in Black. I love this conversation. Right. This is exactly what I try to do in Democracy in Black. Right. I switch our language. I don't like unconscious bias talk. I like habit talk.
Sure.
Right. Sure. So I talk about how we're habituated to believe that in the value gap. Right. And you learn by just simply driving around. Right. Mm-hmm. So I'm not so much interested in the loud races. That's too easy. That's too melodramatic. Right. But I tell my students all the time, you learn race just by navigating Princeton. That's all you got to do is walk down Nassau Street And you're going to shift into the people who clean up your throw up on Thursdays and Fridays. You learn race by simply driving around the way in which this neighborhood, the way in which Trenton and these places have been zoned, right? You learn race by the neighborhoods in which you live, right? So how we are habituated to live the value gap requires, right, a certain kind of consciousness of the habits themselves. And why do I move from unconscious bias to habituation? I get it from Aristotle. Habits are critical to character formation. I'm suggesting because of, let me put it a little bit, it's going to be abstract and I'm going to make it concrete. Abraham Lincoln could not become the kind of person his conception of democracy required precisely because of the racial habits he held, right? That moved him about. Right? And so here, we can't become the kinds of people that our democracy demands if these racial habits still obtain. And so just as you can quit smoking, you can break the habit. We can break the habit of racial inequality if we understand that policy has to be deliberate in our efforts to address it. So that's the only thing. So I don't use.
I really like that framing. Yeah, I really like that. Using policy to break the habit of racism, I think, is an incredibly powerful way to frame it. Here's what actually happens, though, and this is where my critique of the Democratic Party comes out. Okay. You talk about the belief that you have to subordinate conversations about race to appeal to these white hard hat workers who the Democratic Party feels like they need to come back. I don't think the Democratic Party is so naive as to believe they actually have to throw Black people under the bus to get ahead. I think that the Democratic Party understands that that's a decision, that's an option that they've chosen to take because the alternative of leading with policies that appeal to working class people of all races, the very policies that got those hard hat workers originally following the New Deal, when the Democratic Party truly was a labor party, requires too much of their corporate donor base. And what you're seeing is not a Democratic Party who is too stupid to figure out that you can do this broad multiracial coalition building by offering enormously popular programs like Medicare for All and a $15 minimum wage and marijuana legalization and common sense gun reform and free public college and all of this. They understand that every poll in the world says that that's what would be able to put back together a working class multiracial coalition. They are choosing not to do that because they are prioritizing a donor base that doesn't want that. And at the end of the day, that's why you get this bifurcation between a Republican Party who is willing to use identity politics in the form of racism, right, to weaponize whiteness in order to make a poor white population feel like they can get something from a Republican Party that otherwise offers them nothing but tax breaks for the rich, and a Democratic Party who similarly betrays its predominantly Black and brown working class base while fighting for these SALT tax deductions that are, again, just giving more money to elites, throwing a $15 minimum wage under the bus, pretending like a parliamentarian really stood in your way, and saying, well, what I'm giving you is I like Black people and brown people and immigrants and LGBTQ people, and this is enough. And so you have these culture wars that both corporate parties benefit from. And Democrats say, oh, I'm so mad about this Dr. Seuss discourse, but you turn on the TV and all you get is Dr. Seuss discourse on both channels. And nobody is willing to talk about what you're saying, Professor Eddie. Sorry, it's a hard habit to break.
It's okay.
Which is leading with policy is how you reconstitute this union that we need so badly. And in fact, the one guy, I'm sorry to be all Bernie brain about this, but it matters for our long-term project. The one guy who was saying exactly that becomes a pariah. Pariah
in inverted commas. He's chairing a very substantive committee in the Senate.
Okay. Well, I think that we should talk about realistically what that means because so much of this, the same argument for how the symbolic can become a distraction or a placeholder or make people feel appeased, right, is relevant in this conversation. Is it enough that Bernie
No.
gets as chair committee. Is it enough that Biden and all of them said they wanted a $15 minimum wage, and if at the end of the day they refused to fight for it and not to use their leverage? Not. So that's why I'm very skeptical of this kind of language that says, I see you, I hear you, I'm going to give you this position. Let's have a committee on reparations to see about the reparations. Let's have a commission on equal rights to see about the equal rights. I
agree with you 100%. This is the thing, right? Because I agree with you 100%. I've read my Adolph Reed too closely not to agree with it, right? I understand the pitfalls of custodial forms of custodial politics.
Yeah.
I understand what Jim Clyburn has done and continues to do. I remember saying on Chris Hayes, I don't care if he knows me. What I need to know is policy, 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 policy.
Right.
What you going to do, right?
Well, that's why you're one of our best, Eddie.
But part of what I'm trying to insist on, and this is what I think Baldwin, and this is why I reached for him in my moment of despair and disillusionment, is that he understands the American project in a way that most writers, most of our interpreters of American democracy don't. Right? He takes Emerson by the collar and brings him across the tracks. And what Baldwin sees at the heart of this place is a refusal to grow up, right? A kind of immaturity rooted in the illusion that this is some example of democracy achieved. Right? That this idea of the country is always already on the road to a more perfect union is the most efficient ideology to keep the country from looking itself squarely in the face. So the project that you and I agree upon, right? You suggest, and this is where I'm pausing. Maybe it's because I'm in the ivory tower. You suggested we need to pursue it in such a way that that we can't derail it by calling attention to that contradiction in explicit terms. If I'm misrepresenting your argument, let me know.
I don't think that is it.
So what is the basis of our disagreement then? Because on the one hand, you're saying that I'm not being practical or pragmatic in the way in which I'm talking about this question. So I want to understand the basis of our disagreement then.
I think it's a somewhat a question of audiences. So.
And who's centered in the political discourse?
Well, no, sometimes you're talking to one audience and sometimes you're talking to another audience. Okay. And it's the language isn't necessarily a problem except for when it's deployed in the wrong space. So if I'm reading your book and I'm to me it's perfectly fine. I agree. I find the kind of literary language deployed by Baldwin and yourself and people like Ta-Nehisi Coates to be deeply cathartic, frankly, on some level as a Black person. But I also know as a person who, because of working on a campaign or because of journalism, has had to interface with people who don't already agree with me, that is not the language that I would necessarily use with those groups. Not because I'm trying to hide the ball or cater to their ideology, but because if for part of my political project, I want them to agree with me, it serves me and my interest to communicate in a way to them that is going to lead them along the trail of breadcrumbs in a slower way than I would approach someone who is already a member of my choir. And I think that you understand that. I'm not pretending that you think that this book is a field guide to go out into, the middle of the panhandle and start proselytizing. And I don't mean to be that way. But what I do think happens is that there are figureheads that don't share your policy beliefs and don't share your historical understanding and don't share your commitment to left politics, who use language about original sin and how what we have to do is, quote, build a world where such a view has no place or quarter to breathe. Use the kind of openness and the vagueness of that language, the kind of the spiritual vagueness of that, to say that should be our central project, not Medicare for all, not equal housing for all, not canceling student debt, not canceling medical debt, right? And I absolutely do not believe that is your project, because I have followed you for years and I have so much admiration for you, and that's why I'm bringing you here today. But what I'm questioning is whether or not that kind of language is weaponized in service of maintaining a status quo where we can all sit and kind of pick the lint out of our belly buttons and talk about the abstraction of racism without talking about that important piece that you brought up that I think is put so well, which is that policy can be a tool to start to change people's hearts and minds, as it were.
The more we talk, the more I'm beginning to think that we don't disagree on
it's very narrow
on the substance of the matter. It's really about perhaps a different space in which we function, in which we operate. So the political question, as you imagine it, or as you enact it, is shaped and framed by, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, by the reality of bare knuckle politics, of the electoral process and the like. The politics that, how I'm imagining it, has at its core a moral question, an ethical question about who do we take ourselves to be, who do we aspire to be, right? And trying to deconstruct this insidious view at the heart of America's self-conception that requires of you and me a kind of quieting of who we are and how this country has oriented itself to people like us. And what do I mean by that in its particulars? Baldwin has this wonderful formulation. It's the early Baldwin. It's in an essay entitled Many Thousands Gone, in Notes of a Native Son. And he says, it's as if you want to make our faces blank in order to wash away your guilt. That the precondition for and this is my language, that the precondition for my entree into American society is that I have to leave the particularity of who I am at the door. And that's on the right and on the left in this country. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to argue for and to fight for and to give voice and language to what might be necessary to clear the space for us to imagine ourselves otherwise. And I worry, Bree, if I may, that if we concede to the demands of politics as such, out of the practical and pragmatic impetus, that we have to talk in this way as opposed to that way, that we may leave in place, right, the very things that end up, choking the life out of democratic possibility in the country in the first place.
I hear that concern. But I guess as you were saying that, I think that the difference might actually be less the field in which we're fighting or the space, the audience that we're speaking to or the spaces that we're occupying professionally, and but the order of operations. Because it's not to me to say we're not going to talk about the particularity of that experience. You must. I could not agree more. But I think it's what comes first. Do we lead with the policy? Or do we lead with the, discussion of entrenched racism? Yeah. Do we start? It makes me think of
both ends.
It absolutely has to be both. But practically, sorry to use that word again, when you start a conversation with someone, you start somewhere. Right. You start somewhere. So I'm thinking of this fellow whose name escapes me, but he was famous for having converted a number of Ku Klux Klan members to not being Klan members anymore. And he had like 17 of these outfits in his closet because every time they left the Klan, they would give it to him. And it was kind of like a notch on his belt, this black guy. And when interviewed and asked, how do you do it? He says, well, I start by asking them to come and sit down and have a Coke with me. And I ask them if they have kids. And I say, I have kids. And we talk about our kids. And they realize that I love my child and I'm a father and I'm a parent. We have this very basic thing in common. Now, I wouldn't accuse that man of being indifferent to racism, not caring about racism, trying to hide the fact that obviously what's driving him is a desire to decouple these men from their conscription into a virulently racist sect, right? Mm-hmm. But the step one isn't for him, practically, hi, you're a Klan member, you're racist, stop, I hate you, which everyone would have every justification to say to anybody, obviously. But he is effective in part because he understands that the starting point is elsewhere. And I guess my view is that, and I wrote this about an article. I wrote this in an article I wrote in response to Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The First White President, years ago. There's a certain kind of discourse right now, very popular among kind of like the Black intelligentsia, that says white people won't support a policy if they perceive it to benefit Black people and brown people.
Well, that comes out of the University of Chicago's law school study, right?
Right. And it's true. I'm not disputing that. Mm-hmm. The point that I try to make is, okay, then what's the plan? If your argument is framing a policy as for Black people actually makes it less likely to succeed, is the plan to double down on doing that because you hate the idea that doing otherwise is to somehow ignore racism or to cater to racism? Is the plan to not pursue those policies at all, even though they help everybody that needs to be helped the most? Or on some level, is it appropriate to say, hey, I actually just support this universal policy, and I'm going to go to a white area and say, this policy helps you. I'm going to go to a Black area and say, this policy helps you, but not necessarily frame and design every policy so that it is the American plan to disproportionately benefit Black people by getting them a $15 minimum wage, and actually just say, hey, it's a $15 minimum wage. Hey, white people, this is good for you. And moreover, what it strikes me as being the case is that the very people who will say we can't have nice things because white people don't like policies that benefit Black people ignore universal policies that can be framed broadly, because they are in fact broad and benefit anyone, and tend to disproportionately focus on those policies that do benefit marginalized groups, specifically on the basis of them having been historically discriminated against. Those policies should be pursued 100%. But the very people who are like, white people don't like policies because they appeal to Black people, exclusively then go and pursue policies like anti-redlining policies or reparations, which I support, while ignoring policies like Medicare for all and free college tuition that in fact would do a better job of skipping over that hurdle of white resentment, because it in fact isn't a means-tested program that can be written off as for the poor, Black and brown, lazy, blah, 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 all the welfare hand-wringing that the Clintons and the Reagans and all the third wave people engaged in for the last 30 years. So do you see what I'm saying? It feels like all of these narratives end up serving the interests of the corporatists who want us to keep fighting about race. The left has this version, it feels like, of making us fight about race under the auspices of, oh, we are anti-racist. And the right says, let's talk about race because we are racist. And there are gains to trade there. There is simpatico to be had. And both sides are using race as a way to keep us from talking about it. And it's not that race isn't important and it doesn't need to be addressed head on. But there is a way that race is inserted in a way that starts to feel strategic to derail any substantive policy effort that, in fact, to your point, Eddie, would do a lot to getting at the root of American racism in the first instance.
Let me just say this, because this is fascinating. This is fascinating on so many different levels. One can conclude that the two-party system deploys racial identity talk in ways that reproduce all sorts of noxious views with regards and outcomes with regards to race. The identity politics of the Republican Party, the way in which white grievance and white resentment is weaponized for their own particular ends. Either we're, one way to put it, either we're Willie Horton or Bigger Thomas. And, Bigger Thomas, of course, is, the project of the white liberal, right? As opposed to, right, dealing with the actual human beings on the ground. Yeah. So we could concede that, and we could say very clearly that the way in which, the reality of racism functions in American politics actually reproduces all of these noxious outcomes and obscures more than it illumines. Now, then the question is the answer to that, right? To put race aside? Bree would immediately say, of course not. You can't.
No.
Right? The answer to that then is it to leave those commitments that animate the choices of so many people who identify themselves as white, right? And those commitments are rooted in very troublesome assumptions about Black people and people of color, to not try to activate those commitments so that we can appeal to their self-interest in order to achieve X, Y, and Z, but we leave those commitments in place with untouched, right? Since they could be activated in later events, which would then undermine the actual policy initiative when it comes to be revealed that Black folk are disproportionately beneficial, or if a political party decides to show that although white people are benefiting more from these social services programs, we suddenly make welfare Black after Robert Kennedy rubs the face of this Black girl, right, in the Delta of Mississippi? Do we wait until that happens and then suddenly grievance is activated and da-da-da? Or do we try to figure out and develop a political language that cuts through the mess and gets us to the heart of both and? Mm-hmm. Because it seems to me that you're fighting a battle that you shouldn't be fighting. And and oftentimes we find ourselves in this pragmatic space. And, as a pragmatist who studied John Dewey, I kind of, I chafe under the way in which we're using pragmatic is really practical in some ways, right? That's what we mean. And I'm trying to think that perhaps what is being viewed as practical actually is setting us up to have to deal with this again, to have to deal with it again and again and again and again. So I'm just repeating myself here. Shouldn't we be trying to generate a language, a political language that could do both and, as opposed to in some ways muting one in the practical pursuit of the other?